Need more volume. Okay.
Okay, this is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us via Zoom Robert Irving III. Um, eh, after a lot of technical difficulties today, finally we have this interview going. How are you today, Robert?
I'm good. Thank you so much for
Oh,
inviting me. And how are
oh,
you?
thank you, thank you. Well, first of all, Robert, we've been playing tracks and giving background to our listeners about uh, art of protest, and it's such a moving album.
Oh,
And
wow.
yes, it's amazing. And I just wanted to know, at what point in your career did you become an activist for social justice, or have you been an activist for a long time?
Well, that's a good question. I think um, any artist who's conscious, consciously aware of what's going on around them and in the world, um, it eventually is going to have to reflect in the music or the art or the poetry. And so I think for me, that started very early. When I was working with Miles Davis, we traveled. In fact, my first performance with Miles was in Poland at the Jazz Jamboree behind the Iron Curtain. And there was a black market for dollars. We were warned not to use dollars to pay for anything. And of course, there were tanks on the street, Russian soldiers. And it's interesting now, now there's a resurgence in this whole thing with Russia and Ukraine. But back then, the Polish people were persecuted. And they needed those dollars in the black market to help feed their families because they made very little money. I think we were at dinner one night and the waiter whispered to us, I'll give you a good deal if you use dollars. And we had already been warned not to use dollars. But the road manager said, well, what kind of deal? And so he came back and there were 12 people with a really huge dinner with dessert and with the wine and everything. And he was only going to charge us $50 for this huge dinner for 12 people. And of course we gave them 3 times that much because for us, it was not a big deal. But they explained to us that was the monthly salary. What we gave them would pay the monthly salary for 4 people. And so at that time, I became aware firsthand of the need for social justice on a very large scale. And so consequently, when we did our recording, we included a piece that was dedicated to the whole idea of the imminent attack of a foreign power in the case of Russia, particularly, just as a sort of a parody, and that was called There Were None, and that was recorded and written, composed by Miles and I, and we used the sound of sirens and the idea that Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, had pushed the wrong button. And at the end, Miles says, I meant the other button, Ron, speaking to Reagan. So yeah, I think artists, there's not necessarily a obligation to speak out or to reflect what the social climate is in the art and the music. But for those who do feel that that's important and you have something to say, then I would say, yeah, absolutely, that we should reflect that. And so for me, that's, if that answers your question, it was very, very early in my career.
Yes. And so at that time, what about Miles Davis? Because we know that he was your mentor. And did you and he do any other social justice work before then? It was just music?
It was just music. It was just
Mhm.
music. I mean, we had just started working. I was quite young, relatively so at that time, and he had already done so much, and he had been off the scene for about 6 or 7 years before he did the comeback, which is The Man with the Horn, which we worked on
Mhm.
together in years prior. And of course, he had suffered from the Jim Crow era, not so much segregation because he lived mostly in New York, but still there was police brutality that he experienced. There was the being stopped driving a nice car, that went on way beyond the 60s and 70s. I think that happened even in the 80s. He was driving his Ferrari, up in Topanga Canyon because he lived in Malibu, and he would be stopped because he was driving an expensive Ferrari, And so he was always conscious of those things and spoke about them. And I think he was also about being accommodating and forgiving and understanding that it wasn't black against white. It was evident that in all his bands he hired white musicians, and he on the artistic level and in community within community, he knew that he had to work with all kinds of people, and so there was a need for people to be humane, to follow the dictates of the heart, and not necessarily the I guess you could say the tendency for people to focus on the negative things that are happening around us, but to focus on the positive and to contribute something that can to add to that the dialogue that's about bringing people together and that's about healing.
Well, we're really interested. You said that the police officers would stop Miles Davis because of the expensive Ferrari that he drove. Well, once the officers knew that this was Miles Davis, did they change their tune? Did any of the officers do you know of ask Miles Davis for his autograph?
Now, I've never heard of that having happened. In fact, the famous story that happened at a club in New York, during the break, he went upstairs. It was a club that was in the basement. He went upstairs
Mhm.
to walk a white woman to make sure that she got in her cab okay.
Mhm.
In that neighborhood, maybe it was a little rough, and he was just being a gentleman. And the police officers who were outside just on their regular beat saw that, observed that, and gave him a hard time. And it escalated into violence. He was hit over the head with a billy club while trying to explain to the officers that he was Miles Davis and that he was performing downstairs, and they didn't care. So I mean, it's one of those things where an associate of mine, about maybe 10 years ago, he was a professor at one of our universities in music business professor. And he had a group of students, about 50 students, and he asked them to raise their hands to show how many knew the name of Miles Davis. And out of 50 students, there were maybe 4. Now, so that's to say that we're not educating our youth. We're not placing a focus on the legacies of artists as great as Miles Davis. And when we just had what would have been his, I believe, 95th birthday, there was very, very little said about Miles. And so it's no wonder that the police would not know the name of Miles Davis.
Mm-hmm. We know that you're very active in mentoring youth at the Jazz Arts Institute and the African Arts Ensemble. So how did you start with that? Was it that you observed that there isn't enough attention being paid to uh, Black artistry and jazz, and that's what initiated your work, or is it just that you love the work so much and then you just wanted to help youth, help the talented youth enter the business?
Well, so yeah, that's a good question. So, we, as a student of life and as a student of music, and it doesn't matter how old we get, we remain a student if we want to continue to grow and learn and develop. But in my case, I recognize, and from the stories that I got from Miles, that he was very much appreciative and valued the relationships of his mentors, and particularly Dizzy Gillespie and Billy Eckstine. He talked about them excessively in stories and passed along. And he looked up to them. He was given opportunities at a very young age. He was a teenager when he played with Jay McShann's big band. Mm-hmm. And so he had a lot of opportunities as a young person. So he understood that despite the fact that he was still developing as an artist, as a creative artist and musician, that these guys saw something and heard something in him, and they gave him tips and pointers, and talked about, Dizzy talked to him about studying piano as a way to expand as a composer and to have a better understanding of the trumpet. This was the same thing that my band teacher had taught me in high school, because I was a trombone player. I played all the brass instruments in high school. And so I too knew the value of mentorship, having been mentored by some really, really great musicians, including Tom Tom 84 at that time, who was the arranger for Earth, Wind and Fire. And so during the early 2000s, I was asked to substitute teach out in Lake Forest. And it was just a combo class, jazz combo class. And so the director of the program, the music program out there at Lake Forest, this is high school, knew who I was and invited me to teach piano privately to students who were classical piano students who wanted to make the transition into jazz. And so I said, yeah, we can do that. And I was impressed by the fact that the funding for this didn't come from the school. It came directly from the parents, who wrote a check to me as the instructor. And I had students who knew nothing about improvisation, but who could read classical music, and understood the piano in every other way, but you couldn't ask them to solo or to improvise. And so I developed a system to be able to convey that in a way that was very simplified, and they excelled really quickly. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, this is something that the Black community could really value, that could be very valuable. And I had the idea that if musicians, African-American or better stated, Black musicians from wherever they came from ancestrally, if they were able to adopt one child, just one, and personally mentor that child in whatever instrument they chose, how much of a difference that would make, especially in communities where music programs have been decimated as far back as during the Reagan administration, in order to pay for the tax cuts that he gave. Basically, music programs got cut as a result. And so I understood the need for this. And also Phil Coran at that time had the same vision. And so we got together and we created a program to teach free music programs on the South Side. And that was through just a small not-for-profit organization. We never went for a 501c3, but that summer we had about, I think we had close to about 75 students. And we not only taught the students, but we taught the parents. so that the parents could reinforce the studies and the lessons. And I taught piano. Phil Coran taught brass. We had a dance teacher. We had percussionists. We had guitar, bass, and I believe that was it. And it went on for an entire summer. We lost the location, which was at a church. And so the program didn't continue. And so it was from that program that I was invited to become a mentor with the Jazz Institute. So I was already very active in doing this. And the Jazz Institute gave me a platform and a structure by which to do this on a larger scale, and with youth who were already developing in music programs in their individual schools and with private lessons. And I suggested that, well, why don't we do a CD with these students and teach them the inner workings of production, of music production, of understanding publishing, because they had to do the publishing and affiliation with performing rights organizations. A lot of them couldn't do these things themselves because they were under 18, but nevertheless, we helped them set up the infrastructure for their parents to be able to control until they became of age. And so, as you may remember, the CD was released back, I think around, I forgot the exact year, but that was the first and so far the only Jazz Institute recording project. And I think it would be a good idea to do another project with the new, with this new generation of students.
Mm-hmm. Was that the New Momentum?
No, so New Momentum was my own personal CD. That CD, what did we call it? Was it because it's still, you probably have it there. It's probably still in the system, but it's actually published by the Jazz Institute. I want to say, let's see, Jazz Institute. It will take me a minute to look it up, and I have the CD around here. If you give me a moment, I could grab it. I think I know where it is.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah. So, if I can still hear you, if you want to, you have another question you want to divert to. Mm-hmm. Okay, here it is. So it's The Drive is the name of the CD.
The Drive.
Jazz Links. The Drive.
Okay, awesome. Yes, because I think our listeners would be very interested in listening to some tracks from that. So we'll see if we could get some of the tracks later and then play them. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Do you know what it was about your composition Space that captured Miles Davis's interest and led to Davis having you write and arrange the Man with the Horn for him?
Well, so the thing was, there's a whole backstory that goes with that. Space, it was a song, it was an instrumental kind of funk jazz fusion track. It utilized the sound of a pianette, which is a cross between a piano and a clavinet made by Horner, the company that makes the clavinet. And I used a wah-wah pedal on it, so it had this sound that Miles had never heard. And I also used the Mini Moog synthesizer, which was not being used so much in jazz. So Miles, because he was always forward looking and he was always thinking of what the next thing was. He had not himself, mind you, he had not played in about 5 years. And so he was in semi-retirement, and the band that I was with was the group Data, which eventually changed its name to AL7. And that consisted of myself with Randy Hall, the guitarist and vocalist, Miles Davis's nephew, Vince Wilburn Jr., who's a drummer, and bass player Felton Cruz. And there were other musicians. There was saxophonist Glenn Burris. And so we were just developing music really for our own personal project. And Tom 84, the arranger for Earth, Wind & Fire, heard about what we were doing and invited us into the studio to record. So basically just gave us studio time to go in and just document what we were doing. And the idea that was that he was going to take that recording either to, well, he was going to take it to Maurice White, the leader of Earth, Wind & Fire, and have him consider signing our group for his label, Kalimba Productions, or his production company. But, and a lot of the songs were kind of more pop, fusion, funk oriented. But Space was a little bit different in that it was instrumental. And it was perhaps it represented some kind of continuity of where Miles had come from in terms of his electronic excursions. And most of his electronic stuff, in terms of keyboards, only had organ and or Fender Rhodes piano sounds. So that was the extent of the electronics and of course, electric guitar on those albums. So now all of a sudden he's hearing something, some new elements of keyboards and other possibilities. And I think he found it so fascinating that he called his nephew, and when he heard it over the phone, he would repeatedly call and ask him to play it again over the phone. And eventually, you know, there were no CDs at that time. It was only cassette tapes. So he asked for a cassette tape. And when he received the cassette tape, then he called me personally and asked if we could come to New York to record that one song. And I said, yeah, of course. Well, that led to us going to New York and basically doing the same thing that we had done at the studio in Chicago. And that is to document all of our material in addition to that song, and to basically kind of coax Miles out of his retirement, because during that time he wasn't playing the trumpet, he was only playing organ. And as we were going in the studio to document the music, the producer Tio Macero, he said to me, he said, Bobby, you know, this is all great, sounds wonderful. He said, but until we hear the trumpet of Miles Davis, you know, it's not going to go anywhere. And he couldn't have that conversation with Miles because, you know, they had a huge rift stemming from Tio Macero's release of Quiet Nights against Miles's knowledge. And so anyway, I conveyed this to Miles. I said, Miles, you know, we would love to hear some horn on your trumpet on this. And he said, well, you don't like my organ playing, you know? Like, so yeah, but you know, we want to hear the man with the horn. And so he came in the studio that Monday and he played. And I know, being a brass player, that if you've not played in a long time, the ideas can be in your fingers, it can be in your brain, but your lip is not going to produce the sound. And that's what was happening. And he sounded like a beginner. And so consequently, we were sent home. And presumably the end of the project. But then from that day, which was sometime in September, I think, up until around Christmas, he had been working and playing long tones, I'm sure, and developing his embouchure, his lip, so that he could produce that clear, beautiful tone that he's known for. Mm-hmm. And so he called me around Christmas and said, check this out. And so he started playing, you know, and I could tell that I knew that he'd been working all that time, very hard. He says, well, what should I play on? So then we went back to New York, and Randy Hall and I did some more collaborating, and we came up with just in really a few minutes, the idea for The Man with the Horn, and we recorded it. And we had no idea that it was going to be on the album. We had no idea. But it ended up not only being on the album, but being the title track of the album. And we were pretty surprised that he would take such a big jump and risk, as it were, in terms of not following the sort of protocols of continuity from where he had been to what was next. So he kind of jumped ahead by about 5 years with the man with the horn. But of course, we appreciated that, and we even now, looking in retrospect, have even a greater appreciation for his courage in taking that kind of step, because now that album is sort of a in dedication to him, the man with the horn himself.
Well, evidently, Miles is kind of like you, because even during those 5 years, it seems as if he still, like, he was listening and then putting new things together. That's why he was so uh, mesmerized when he heard space. So it's that's, I guess, that's what you do, put different things together.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, he had, he listened to a lot of music, a lot of different types of music. And before we did this, The Man with the Horn, he had actually been in the studio with Mtume, who we just lost, James Mtume. And some of those guys with whom he had worked on Bitches Brew and those recordings. And they were experimenting, but by the time I got there, Miles was speaking a lot about classical music composers, particularly Schoenberg, Arnold Schoenberg, the Austrian-German composer. He was really enamored with, particularly Rite of Spring, Stravinsky's work. He spoke a little bit about Rachmaninoff, and he encouraged me to study these composers and to listen. At that time, it was not as accessible in terms of being able to go to a YouTube channel and pull up something. But he loved that music so much so that he told me to turn on a recording, the tape recorder, and he said into the recording, which I still have somewhere, I have to find it. And he said, when I die, and then he corrected himself. He said, I mean, if I die. He said, I want them to play the introduction to the Rite of Spring when they roll me down the aisle. And I thought, wow, he really loves this music. And you could say that music somehow found its way into the things that he did. And in fact, years, like 20 years after I produced Decoy, and finally we have the internet and we can do searches for music. I said, I never really studied Schoenberg. I knew about his 12-tone system of composition, but I had not really taken in very much of his work. And so I Googled and up came a concerto for strings, for violin. And there was I believe the second passage, or this second movement, where there was a melody in the violins. And I was just really blown away by the fact that some phrases that I had composed in Decoy 20 years prior were verbatim almost in that passage melodically. And I was just blown away. It's like, and this was prior to Miles talking to me about that. And so I don't know if he heard it, if he knew it, but somehow I think musicians have an ability to channel sound and channel music that's really from another realm that already exists, and rather than create it coming from us, it's coming through us, which is the whole idea originally, the Greeks term muse, from which we get the idea of music, that there's a muse that's sort of you channel those vibrations and harmonies.
Yeah, because that sounds kind of reminiscent of some discussions that I had with my mother. She kind of mentioned that the most beautiful music is the music that seems as if it had been in the universe forever.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, I agree. You know, when I was doing a lot of meditation and studying metaphysics back around the time that I first started working with Miles's nephew and Randy Hall and those guys, and we were rehearsing at a temple, a spiritual temple, and they were doing numerology and so we learned this meditation where you have the fingers around your ears and then the thumb behind your neck, and you're doing just deep breathing and clearing the mind. You're not really thinking of anything, just clearing thoughts. So I was alone at home doing it, and suddenly the only way I could describe it, it was as if there was a waterfall flowing through me, and each drop of water had a sound, like flutes and violins and a note. And each note was sort of, as it made contact, it sounded. And it was like this galactic symphony. And the only way you could reproduce it, would be with a million players. And so and it seemed like it lasted forever. And when I explained this to the minister, the priest, he said, "Well, you opened your psychic hearing to the sound of the universe, the sound of the spheres," as he put it.
Yes.
And I thought that was really interesting, and I feel like that I was sort of initiated into hearing within that realm and being able to channel sound and music out of that realm.
Mm-hmm. When you spoke earlier about the Jazz Institute, I wanted to follow up with that before I forget. Uh, how did they hear about your work and then invite you to mentor you at the Jazz Institute? It seems as if, or was it just like rumor?
Yeah, so actually, it was I who made contact with them.
Mhm.
I knew of some of the things that they were doing, particularly in the area of programming, festivals and different events and workshops. And I became a member. I just joined,
Oh. Mhm.
and in doing so, uh, despite the fact that I had done a lot of things with Miles and done a lot of things with Wallace Roney and David Murray and so many, I was in Chicago, not on the radar of the Jazz Institute, because most of the things I was doing were in New York, California, or the tours were in other countries, and so I was not really actively on the radar in terms of a local Chicago jazz scene.
Mhm.
And typically, musicians who are doing things internationally, it's like there's a saying that prophet is without respect in his own hometown. And so it was not until I introduced myself and that I made them aware of the things that I was doing. And then of course, it was quickly recognized the value and the contribution that I could make towards what they were doing, because there was a congruence,
Mhm.
very strong congruency with what they were doing and what I was already doing and what my vision was in terms of passing on knowledge to the next generation
Mhm.
and preserving the legacies of the musicians whom shoulders we stand.
Mhm. Do you have a lot of students who are your mentees and that have that you're passing along, a lot of your legacy to them?
Absolutely, yeah. And even before I realized what my impact was when I was doing the teaching up at Lake Forest,
Mhm.
private lessons, I ran into at a Jazz Institute event. It was a fundraiser, like a gala, and there was the chair of the music department up in Northwestern, and it happens to be that we were, you know, I had performed, and so he knew who I was, and he introduced himself. He says, I've been wanting to meet you. He said, because a lot of my students cite you as the reason why they got into jazz. And I said, really? And I was really curious about that, whether it was students from the Jazz Institute whom I had mentored. But it turns out that these were the students from Northwestern who had studied classical piano and who made that transition into jazz and went on to attend Northwestern. And I think because they had the classical background, but at the same time had a sensitivity to jazz, that helped them to sort of go over the top and excel in the programs over at Northwestern. But yeah, so over the years, I've had a great number of students who've taken it on the responsibility to approach me about private lessons. So I've worked with them outside of the Jazz Institute, but now the Jazz Institute has fellowship programs where students who've gone through their program can audition and apply for fellowship grants to study with whomever they like. And so as a result of that, I've had 3 students, particularly piano students, who have chosen to study with me. And it's always very rewarding on one side, but as we know, the teacher also remains a student. So I'm learning from them, and because I'm having to identify their needs in the same way that Miles identified my deficiencies musically and then gave me instruction that helped to inform those to get me to the next level. And so that's sort of my methodology with the students, is to find where they're at and then to challenge myself to challenge them with materials that take them far beyond where they're at and get them closer to the idea of just this unlimited, vast terrain that we can mine as miners, like gold miners,
Yes.
as it were.
How long do students usually stay with you, or does it vary?
Well, currently, the program that with the fellowship program, those grants are for 25 lessons. And so it just depends on how they are divided out. I have a student now it's once a week, it's every week. And so that gives us a more intensive, almost like, because there's preparation time for me to prepare for what I'm going to share with them. And there's an accumulation of information. And so there's a lot of homework for them. So it's not just that one lesson per week. It's the things that I have to do to prepare and the things that they have to do in terms of homework that almost makes it like a ongoing master's class for those 25 sessions. And which later on, maybe as we get saturated with information and things to do, that we'll stretch it out and it'll be maybe twice a month, and then eventually once a month, so that it kind of gives them the chance to develop. And the goal for me is not just for them to develop themselves, but to develop a body of work or portfolio that encompasses and exemplifies the things that they learn.
So do the students have juries at the end, or what is the what are the end lessons like?
So again, these are master's classes that cover such a wide range of things. Because I'm a composer, and because I recognize that part of our legacy that people will remember, that will live beyond us is not what we do as musicians, but it's what we create as creators, composers specifically. So I get into creating a body of work that's not just recorded, but notated so that you can publish it, that you can actually have your work published in a book or in a series of books. There's a part of the lessons that deal with interpretation of other forms of work. For example, interpreting a poem, a specific poem into music. How would you do that? And so there's ways to do that in a process. We get into that. So that's producing work. It's producing, and so all of that work that's created. So there are different harmonic concepts that are beyond what they know right now. There's different ways to approach composition. So the whole focus again is not just playing the music, but actually creating the music and documenting what that is. And so there's not necessarily a performance or a test or what have you at the end, because that's something that as we go along, that's being documented and notated. And so it becomes then their own personal portfolio.
Yeah, that's beautiful. What are applications like? How could students apply to study with jazz greats like you?
So for me, it's kind of word of mouth. Most of my private students have come through the Jazz Institute, and so that's probably the easiest way for students to become affiliated with the Jazz Institute. The Jazz Institute has a student council, and so that's for the more advanced students, and they can take part in the day-to-day programming and planning, and they get a lot of opportunities, for example, to go to concerts at the Symphony Center when various jazz artists are going to be performing there, and they get to go backstage and talk to folks. They get to explore master's classes, many of which I've done, where we go in there and we have a specific subject, and we go in and we talk. It could be about the music business, publishing, administration, and or production, and so they get a very wide range of exposure to a lot of different areas of the music business. And so I would say just for them to go onto jazzinchicago.org and join, affiliate as a member first, and then sign up for the student council, and then express their interest about studying. And so then that can lead to the kind of possibility for grant programs and so on.
So are all the students on grants, or if they wanted to, if they have the money to pay, then they could just pay to
they can do that. But I prefer to use the Jazz Institute sort of as a clearinghouse for studies with me, because then that way it's a little bit more structured and monitored, especially if they're underage. Then I think that's important.
Yes.
And so I would absolutely still nevertheless recommend that they go through the Jazz Institute.
Absolutely. Back to your earlier band Data, and then you changed the name to AL7. Could you give us a little insight about back at that time there wasn't that much of computers, but how did you come up with the name? How did the band members come up with the name Data? And then what did AL7 represent?
That's a really good observation and great question. And I'm working on my memoir. I started my memoir back in 2010 and been working on it sporadically here and there. Not very much at all last year, but this year it seemed like I'm back on it. And one of the last chapters that I dealt with was exactly that question. And so I was born in Chicago, but then I moved to North Carolina for 8 years. And in 1978, when I moved back here, I sort of reconnected with the music community here, and primarily people who were working with Ramsey Lewis and Earth, Wind and Fire, who I had gone to high school with. And because I've worked with a big band, my band teacher's big band, which two of the horn players from Earth, Wind and Fire actually were horn players in his big band, and who I had a chance to study with and work with, and before Earth, Wind and Fire even was created. And so when I moved back to Chicago, these are the people that I reconnected with and plugged back into. And so Data already existed as a band, and that question of how that name came about is intriguing, and it's a question that I have on my list to ask Vince and Randy Hall in terms of the inception of that. And particularly because this was the 1979 or so, 78, 79, at a time when there were no personal computers. There were only the desktops. There was no, I think there might have been a DOS system, but not many people understood anything. There was no Windows, so of course there was no MacBooks at all yet. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of data and big data was not something that was very common at that time. So that's why I'm too curious about how they came up with that name. I know that my band in North Carolina had the name Mass Production. And back then, at that time, that name, Mass Production, was common because of the amount of manufacturing that was done in the United States. And so our rehearsal place in North Carolina was called the Factory. Mm. And so the Factory is where you do mass production, you know. Mm. But so anyhow, the band consisted of bass player Richard Patterson, Randy Hall, Vince. There was another guitarist, I believe, and there were some personnel conflicts within the band, and Randy being the most prevalent leader of the band, because as the main composer and singer, he sort of just decided to break the band up. And so the band was disbanded after I joined it. Data disappeared, and so it was reformed. And then I guess there was input into what the name would be. And it turns out that there were 7 guys in the band. And mostly firstborn sons, and 2 women. There was his sister Randy Hall and Joan Colasso. At that time, her name was Joan Walton, her maiden name. And so we decided on AL7 because it represented the 7 guys, you know. But the actual name of the band was All, ALL, and that was reflective of the all in all. That concept that as the Rastafarians say, I and I. And so, which basically kind of points to the divine within humans, mm-hmm. and being one with the universe. And so when you spell all, ALL, and the last L, you turn it upside down, then it becomes a 7. Mm-hmm. And so that was the nomenclature of the name and how it worked, you know. Musically, the focus was kind of similar to that of Earth, Wind and Fire, consciousness, numerology, spirituality, astrological phenomenon, and so on.
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, there was no way that we could have guessed that.
Exactly. Exactly.
Which tracks on your current album, Art of Protest, are your compositions and tweaks of old standards, and what caused, like, what developed into that? Was it the George Floyd incident, or did you have this album in the works already before 2020?
So that's a very good question. So Cinnabella Gill, who's the co-producer of the album with me, the way it began, Cinnabella is like a sister-in-law for me. We have her sister married my stepbrother, and so we've always kind of had interaction as kind of cousins, brothers and sisters in a way. And so we had done some things at ETA Theater prior to this. And we were asked to participate in the production of a piece that was going to be sort of a tribute to James Baldwin, the writer. And so the director of ETA Theater, Kai Elzabar, basically approached us and said, look, I would like for you all to consider doing something with the Billie Holiday piece, Strange Fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Senabella had her idea of an arrangement. I had my idea of an arrangement. And so I basically created a demo of my idea. And then she kind of had her idea, and we came together and recorded the vocals without music. So it's just a cappella. And then I superimposed and layered my arrangement on top of that. And the result was pretty interesting. And so I said, well, okay, now let's do it for real. Let's do it, make it intentional. And let's create outside of the structure of the song, of the actual song, in terms of adding different ad-lib sections and different things. And she did that without knowing how I was going to juxtapose these ideas. Mm-hmm. And so I basically utilizing music editing software was able to kind of piece together a really good outline of it. And then when she came back to record it, we also did a green screen video of it. So once it was done, we submitted it to ETA Theater, and it was so impactful for them that it was going to be juxtaposed with poems by James Baldwin, and they had already started recording what they were going to do, and they had to scrap everything to try to bring it up to the standard of what we had presented. So it turned into something completely different. And I said, wow, that had that much impact. And I said, well, what if we just developed an entire album that was based around this protest? Because Strange Fruit was probably maybe the first, like the seminal protest song, Mm-hmm. And in 1939, and it was very controversial. As we know from the movie that came out around the same time that we were working, that she was profiled by the FBI and so on. And the irony of that is that the actual composer or writer of the poem, I guess, the original music, Mr. Maripool, I believe was his name. He actually was a teacher of James Baldwin in New York. So I thought, wow, that's a kind of a strange and interesting correlation.
Yes.
Abel Maripool. And so under the pseudonym of Lewis Allen, I believe that was the pseudonym that he used. And of course, because of the controversy of the tune, and Billie Holiday was blackballed, and probably so was he. So anyhow, I started to imagine songs that could be juxtaposed with this as a part of an art of protest concept. So the title Art of Protest came sort of right away. And then there came the job of curating the music that would comprise that. And so that's how it started. So the song War and Insufficient Peace by Gene Ricks had already been composed, and I was already the solo pianist on that track. So that was easy. And then Riot Enjoy the Fire had already been recorded live at from the Hyde Park Jazz Festival 2010, I believe. And my son Jeremy, who you hear on that, actually performed at that concert. And so basically it was a 21-minute piece. So I had to pare it down to the 5 minutes and 21 seconds. And then we added another spoken word section to that. And then so my daughter, she already had a song recorded that I really loved, and I felt that Vapors should be included. There was one of my mentees, Joshua Moon, who's now at Juilliard, classical piano, just master, who I wrote an arrangement of Lift Every Voice and Sing for solo piano. So that's on there. So the songs that were, so these are songs that were already written and already recorded. But then to fill out the album and to finish it, then Laura Walls and I composed Ode to Dark Men. And then Cinabella had an idea for a song called Dream a Dream, which I arranged for her. And that's sort of how it came together, as just one expression. And we're very happy about it. There's only been one performance of the group, and not all the members of the group, but my daughter, Cinabella, myself, performed at the Bronzeville Jazz Festival back in August, I believe, of last year. Very well received. Sold a lot of CDs. Almost sold out of CDs. And of course, it's been very well received in radio, which we're very happy about. And we appreciate your support on it as well.
That performance live, is there a link to a recording of that, or was it only on CD?
It's just only on CD. So, so there are a couple of songs on the album. So the Strange Fruit recording that Cinabella and I did, it's actually online. It's on Sonic Portraits Jazz website under Art of Protest. Also online is the music video, the official music video of Anytime I Want To, and that's the song and tracked by Mia Rebel, who's based in Seattle, Washington. And in fact, it's getting a fair amount of airplay within the music video world. So those two are definitely on there. Yeah.
So those two tracks on Art of Protest was it taken from that live performance, that only live performance that that some of the members of your band did together? And
no, so that performance actually was recorded, and so far I've not had access to those recordings, to the video footage, but there were a number of videographers out there. So once we do have that, I'm going to definitely be extracting it and putting that up. And in fact, it probably exists somewhere out there. But I want to officially make sure that it's up on the Sonic Portraits Jazz website.
Okay, awesome. Yes, definitely. Speaking of Strange Fruit, that is such a Strange Fruit, that Bitter Crop is such an affecting song. We and at WZRD we do the news, and one of our segments concerned a businessman who killed a Black employee and then buried his body under a septic tank and then lied to the family about it for a month. So so Bill, Bill Morton, he helps me produce these news segments, and then he used the Strange Fruit, that Bitter Crop, for accompaniment, and it was perfect. It was just mesmerizing to to listen, and it just fit so well and so so sadly together. It's
Yeah,
yeah, it was beautiful.
yeah,
Yeah. So yeah, you're that we kind of discussed how haunting and how you know how it's so sorrowful. It's such a beautiful song. It's like the music that we were discussing. Like it's seems as if it were in the universe forever, but
yeah,
it's so sad.
yeah, yeah. The pathos
Yes.
of that music it is. And when sometimes when I do workshops, I will talk about how images, when you're doing a film score and you see a beautiful scene, for example, in the forest, birds and flowers, but if you hear music that's dark and ominous,
Mm-hmm.
then all of a sudden you're starting to wonder, is what's happening, what's coming, what's around the corner.
Mm-hmm.
And so music has a way of being able to both sort of undergird a scene or a topic or an idea and support it,
Mm-hmm.
and or to telegraph what's about to come if things aren't as they seem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so wow, that's a riveting story that you shared. And I can see how Strange Fruit would be very congruent with the uh, the depth of that and all of the emotional uh, turmoil that comes with that kind of story and the discovery of it, what it means for the family. And
Mm-hmm.
that's one thing about the art of protest. I wanted to deal with the lighter side of protest in the sense not of that such a story has any lightness to it, but that there's the lighter side of it in terms of after it's resolved itself and you start to examine the softer feelings of the family members and the reflections on what if I had done this different,
Mm-hmm.
how could that have been avoided, and start to deal philosophically with the aftermath of situations. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with the art of protest. It's not really not about the art of protesting, but it's the art that comes from the aftermath of protest, art as it were. Yeah,
Yeah, what it seems like you're saying is that you are illustrating the ironies of protest in the art of protest.
absolutely. That's the idea. That's the idea. And that's why it's not the art of protest, but art of protest,
Mm-hmm.
in juxtaposition, because if it was the art of protest, then it would be like the art of the deal, the art of this, the art of that. But it's not that. It's
Mm-hmm.
art that
Yes.
emanates from everything. And so like if you take a leaf and you look at the leaf and under a magnifying glass, you're going to see all of these patterns and intricacies. And it's like, whoa, all that's in a leaf. It's like a fingerprint, or the lines on your hands that can be read. There's a story in there. And so it's more about dissecting and going inside of that. I played with Wallace Roney in 2012, I believe. We were in Senegal at the Black Arts Festival that was sponsored by the daughter of the president of Senegal at that time. And so we played actually on Christmas Day, and the concert was under a mountain, at the base of a mountain that had a huge sculpture on top of a man holding a child up to the sky,
Oh.
and the woman next to him. And there were people from all over Africa there, and there was a graduate student from the Congo. And he approached me after the concert and he said, this music that you play doesn't exist in all of Africa. He said, it's as if you played our emotions.
Mm-hmm.
You read our emotions and you played it back to us. And he said, and not only our emotions, but emotions that we didn't know that we had and were included. And I thought, whoa, that's that's profound. The
Yes.
fact that music can have to go beyond uh, the physical into the metaphysical.
Mhm. Well, it seems as if your heart is seeking a lot of like the keys to the universe, and then
Yeah,
you're trying to um, extrapolate it and use the language of music and of jazz to interpret those keys of the universe.
yeah, that's true. I think that's maybe what I've done all my life in
Mm,
terms of the idea that you know the music is in existence in like gold and diamonds and that need to be extracted and examined and then once examined and extracted, then what do you do with that? What are the properties? What can this be shaped into? What kind of jewel? What kind of gold trinket you're gonna have? And so that's kind of the work that we do as artists. And I often like to quote the quote of Miles as I was with him one night um, after he had moved into the Essex house post his divorce. And so he had about 5 canvases because he was deep into the painting and oil. And so while one was drying, he was tweaking something else. And at that time, I was not an artist and I had no interest. But he said to me, Bobby, you should try painting because a painting is music you can see, and music is a painting that you can hear. And I said, whoa, that is so profound. And then I told him, I said, well, you could add to that cooking because he was a gourmet cook and we cooked together sometimes.
mm,
And I said, because cooking is combining flavors and textures and colors together for presentation, the same way that art and music is. And he agreed with me. And years later, I would take on painting and understand that more empirically, that it's not these 3 separate things of cooking, art, and music. They're all the same creativity expressed in different means. And so when you start to look at it from that perspective, it's like the ice can become water and the water can become vapor. They just change forms. And they each have an expression and a property as such. And so, but they're the same thing.
When it seems as if for cooking, when you add love to the cooking tastes so much better. And
Absolutely.
and then I think that for art and music, it seems as if you put a lot of love into it. That's why it makes it special.
Yes. Well,
For
love and authenticity in terms of passion.
yes,
So even if that passion is anger, if you're angry at something, it's usually it's a way to create boundaries. In other words, anger, if it's
mhm,
used in a positive way,
yes,
then it's used to create boundaries, which is a good thing.
mhm,
And if we way far into the anger, then it's because we love something else. We love the opposite of it. So love is still there. It's
yes.
just the opposite end of the scale, the spectrum.
What were the songs that you played at that concert in Senegal that affected the audience so much? Do you still remember?
Yeah, so it was mostly songs from the album Bitches Brew.
Mm,
And the one for me that was the most standout and the most interesting in terms of that dynamic would be Spanish Key, because that album has a lot of darkness in it. But with Spanish Key, there's this light that's all of a sudden comes out of it because of the Spanish modal shift that happens in that music. And all of a sudden there's the dark to light, the tension and release.
mhm,
And I think there's something about tension and release that is the thing that pulls our heartstrings. You know, it does it in drama, it does it in many different art forms when it's used in that way and juxtaposed in a way that kind of gives us that sense of danger, but then following that with a sense of calm, with a resolve. And that's kind of what drives art, and especially in drama, of course.
Yes. Mhm. Did you when you were invited to to performing at in Poland, how did that come about? Because of course Poland is kind of restrictive, and but who invited you to sing to perform in Poland?
So you're referring to my first time in Poland, which
Yes,
was
yes, yes.
1983 at the Jazz Jamboree in Warsaw.
Oh, I see.
And despite the fact that Poland was behind the Iron Curtain, around that time, I remember that Mikhail Gorbachev, he was asked in an interview, despite his differences with the West, what were some things that he liked about the West? And his answer was Jack Daniels, Rolls Royce, and Miles Davis. And so so again, despite a person's leanings or political ideology or what have you, there's those common denominators of music, of art, of culture that everybody can identify with. And I think so it was in that case. I mean, while we were in Poland, Lech Walesa, who eventually became the president of Poland, was probably in jail during that time because the solidarity movement that he created, that he founded, was banned. And so you couldn't say the word solidarity, without getting in trouble in Poland. But yet, Miles flashed the solidarity sign after the concert, and people went crazy. And later on, people said, that concert was the sound of freedom. He said that was foreboding the freedom that would come to us in just a few years. And that was, I think, around the same time that Mandela was just being released from prison. It was the same time that the Berlin Wall was still up, but about to fall. So there was a lot of transition in the air globally. There's a lot of things that were getting ready to shift. And I like to think that music, as people say, was the sound of freedom, was sort of the soundtrack of all that change that was about to occur.
Yes, it was like the voice of the watershed moment that was coming about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us at Wizard via Zoom, Robert Irving III. Robert, let's do a community assessment with you. WZRD Chicago, being a nonprofit radio station, must be responsible to the community we serve. WZRD is mandated to file quarterly issues with the FCC on non-entertainment, community-focused programming. And we like to assess the community, such as you, for these quarterly issue topics with 3 questions. First, what is most important to you?
Well, what's most important to me? It's a very good question. When it comes to community, safety, freedom, expression. When I say freedom to express oneself in a positive way, without fear. So being able to live and to move without fear and in a state of clear communication between the people of community.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of which, it seems as if you're a facilitator of such communication with your music.
I'd like to think so. I would like to think so.
The second question is, what long-term problem must we address?
Well, I think education is going to be on the forefront because everything is going to stem from that. And particularly arts education and getting back on track with that. as a part, an important and integral part of education, not as a separate thing, but something that influences the other academic subjects. So that if you start early in music, then you're going to think critically, you're going to think more abstract thinking, you're going to do better in math, you're going to be better able to express yourself in writing. So as we said earlier, all those things are connected. So if we take away the fact that music and the arts is not something that is going to uh, uh, enable a child to go and get a job in a corporation, that's not the approach. It is something that's going to make the child, as an adult, grow up to be more well-rounded and more appreciative of the arts, and thus more supportive of the arts, and thus attending jazz concerts and attending symphony concerts, because there's no separation. It's just all part of the culture of life.
Yeah, that's very beautiful, Robert, because what you're saying is that the three R's are not just reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's like it's four R's that are important:
Yes.
reading, writing, and art.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
Yes, yes. Okay, and the third question is, what problem must be resolved now?
What problem must be resolved now? Hmm. Being able to be able to express ourselves. Again, I'm going back to freedom of expression, to express ourselves with integrity, and in doing so, to agree to disagree sometimes. So I think that's cutting right to the issue of sorts, because there's so much division, so much debate, so much politically, it's all over the place. But people are tending to disagree without being they're tending to disagree and be disagreeable while doing so. So if that can be something that we could just get to very quickly and solve, for everybody to agree to disagree,
Yes.
whatever the subject is, whatever the issue is, and use that as a starting point for dialogue.
Well, you're living that through music, with your compositions and with art of protest.
Yes.
Well, Robert Irving III, thank you so much for joining us. And well, let's. Is there any contact information, such as anything that you would like our listeners to know, like such as maybe to access your other works, or you could repeat
Sure.
the Jazz Institute information again.
So jazzinchicago.org, jazzinchicago.org. That's for the Jazz Institute. And there's a schedule of events, so you can be apprised of all the different upcoming events that are happening. For me, one of the best resources is going to be Jazz, Sonic Portraits Jazz. That is sonicportraitsjazz.com. And there's a lot of different pages. There's one for the art of protest. There's the jazz store, music store there, where you can get all of the various projects that have been released on the label in the last 10 years. There's concessions, t-shirts, and fun things like that. And finally, you can visit Robert Irving III or robertirvingii.com, as that will be updated periodically to reflect a lot of things that I'm doing as an interdisciplinary artist, because I am a painter, a visual artist, as well as a music artist.
You recently had a show at what was it again?
The art exhibition, at Old Town School of Folk Music.
Yes.
Yeah, it was up for 3 months. Yeah.
Yes. Was there any music in the background in that
Not in the
space?
gallery, that would have been a good idea, but because it's a music school, that would, it wouldn't work because they have classrooms adjacent
Oh,
to that. But there was a concert that kicked off the exhibition. It was myself and John Langford, who's a fine Welsh musician, artist, guitarist, singer, songwriter, and we both did a performance prior to the opening of the exhibition on the same stage, and it was really beautiful. About 400, mostly members of the Old Town School of Folk Music were in attendance, and that was on October 28th of last year. And then the art exhibition remained up until January 3rd or so.
is there a recording of that performance with John Langford?
So I videotaped it myself, yeah.
Oh.
And so again, it's a lot of effort in trying to edit and get that stuff out, but that is something that's in the works, that's on the list. So you'll be able to see that pretty soon.
Awesome. Okay. Robert Irving III, thank you so much for joining us on WZRD today, and good luck with all your endeavors and um, all your work for the universe and music.
Thank you so much, Judy. I appreciate you, and I appreciate all the work that WZRD does in the community. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.